The 70th Jubilee, Part 2. Times and Seasons, W.H. Carter, Revisited. In this presentation, we hope to look at the 70-week prophecy in relation to the 70 Jubilee cycles, the biblical calendar, patterns we see of years and Jubilee cycles on entry to the land. We ask the question, do the years start in the spring or autumn? When are years counted from? We looked at the 70-week prophecy and said in Daniel 9 verse 24, 77s are determined for your people and for your holy city. And we realized that more than one 7 could be used. And we went to Leviticus 25 and realized that we could use 7 Sabbaths of years. And we multiplied that out. 7 Sabbaths of years, 49-year Jubilee cycle of Leviticus 25 is the first time period to consider putting in the prophecy of Daniel. And that came to 3,430 years. And we suggested the end of this time period would be 2024 for the final 70th Jubilee. This time, we want to just go back and have a look at the much more familiar 77's prophecy that many brethren have spoken about over the years, which are very interesting to listen to. In this presentation, we will put in a week of years into Daniel 9. So Strong says it literally means 7. So 70 times 7 years equals 490 years, which is interesting because that's 10 Jubilee cycles. Issac Newton and Brother Carter both thought that the 70-week prophecy would follow the 7-year sabbatical cycles of the 70 Jubilee cycles. We will follow this thinking through and see if it does fit into the 70 Jubilee cycles. We note, though, it is not imperative that the smaller 70-week prophecy fits into the sabbatical cycles. It may be they stand alone. Even if the suggestion put forward here is incorrect for the 70-week prophecy, this does not affect the validity of the 70 Jubilee prophecy. So let us look at the 70-week prophecy in relation to the 70 Jubilee cycle. Do they share things in common? And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years. So 1 Sabbath of years equals 7 years. 7 years is the smallest time period to count in regarding the Jubilee periods and Daniel's prophecy. The start of the 70-week prophecy is in Daniel 9 verse 25. We read, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 sevens and 62 sevens." Literally 7s, a 7-year period. AV says weeks. So 7 weeks plus 62 weeks equals 69 weeks. These are weeks of years. So 69 times 7 equals 483 years. Restore and build Jerusalem. We have 4 decrees. The decree of Cyrus in 536 BC, the decree of Darius in 520 BC, the decree of Artaxerxes in the 7th year of his reign, 457 BC, The decree of Artaxerxes in the 20th year of his reign, 444 BC. These are the usual dates given for these decrees. Of course, sometimes we read of others, as we shall see. Even today, brethren are not fully agreed on when the 70-week prophecy starts and ends. Which month does the decree start in? Is it Nisan or Tishri, or random? There are also different counting time periods: lunar, solar, 354 days, and the 360-day year. There is uncertainty which year Jesus died. Usually AD 30 or AD 33 are put forward. So there are different possibilities to consider for a start date and end date for the time period. We don't want to be dogmatic about it at all. What we might expect to see in common: the 70-week prophecy decree being issued on a 7-year sabbatical cycle of the 70 Jubilee cycle. The same measure for counting time. So we're going to count in 7-year periods. And remember, we count the 0 from 1407 BC. So here's the first Jubilee cycle. We are instructed to count in Sabbath years, 7-year periods. We will carry on counting in 7-year periods. Following Brother Carter's suggestion, let us see if the two cycles share a 7-year sabbatical cycle. We will magnify part of the 17th to 18th Jubilee cycle so we can see the sabbatical years in red. (536 BC), we read of Cyrus and his decree. On our Jubilee calendar, it is 17 Jubilees and 38 years. The date of this decree is not divisible by 7. We read in 520 BC, Darius, in his 2nd year, had a decree. On our Jubilee calendar, it is 18 Jubilees and 5 years. The date of this decree is not divisible by 7. For the last 2 decrees, we will magnify part of the 19th Jubilee cycle so we can see in red the sabbatical years. The decree of Artaxerxes in the 7th year of his reign, 457 BC. This date is not divisible by 7. And then we look at the 20th year of Artaxerxes' decree in 444 BC. This date is not divisible by 7. This is the decree that Brother Carter suggests is correct. In Times and Seasons, page 24, the decree of Artaxerxes in the 7th year of his reign, 457 BC. Brother Carter goes on to say that this date should be 455 BC and offers proof in his chronological section. This decree is divisible by 7, showing it fits into the larger Jubilee cycle perfectly. The chances of this are 1 in 7, of course. The decree of Artaxerxes is in the 19th Jubilee cycle plus 21 years in 455 BC, which is divisible by 7. So this is the decree that Brother Carter suggests is correct. Times and Seasons, page 24. Some brethren and commentators suggest 455 BC is the decree of Artaxerxes in the 20th year of his reign. The reason for the apparent discrepancy between 7 years and 20 years is a possible co-regency between father and son, so that's worth considering. We suggest that 455 BC is the correct date following the sabbatical year cycles. The scripture does not intimate that it must follow the sabbatical year cycles. If this is not the correct year for the decree, it in no way invalidates the larger Jubilee cycles that we are considering. If 455 BC is the start of the 70 weeks prophecy, then this implies the following: that solar years should be used as with the larger Jubilee calendar, which Brother Carter put forward. That Jesus was crucified in AD 33 on the 14th of Nisan. The chronologist Rodger C. Young gives strong evidence for the crucifixion being in AD 33, Bible and Spade, 26th of February 2013. If we look at the decree of Artaxerxes in the 7th year of his reign, 455 BC, we can see when this would be on the bigger Jubilee calendar. The decree is in the 19th Jubilee cycle, the 21st year from entry into the land. The time period continues in 7-year periods in synchronization with the 7-year cycles of the larger Jubilee calendar. Both calendars start in Nisan in the spring, we believe. The end of the 483 years from the decree in 455 AD. In the 29th Jubilee cycle, the 14th year from entering the land. The baptism of Jesus. There shall be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Daniel 9:25. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Objections to the death of Jesus in 33 AD. Many have said that Herod died in 4 BC, therefore Jesus must have been born before him, maybe 5 to 6 BC, because Herod had the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under put to death. And we can see Rodger C. Young's article on this with co-author Andrew Steinman, showing that they believe the death of Herod to be 1 BC. Very strong evidence there. Josephus, as you can see there, also mentions about 1 BC. So there are objections to a Nisan start date for the 70-week prophecy. For instance, if you start counting whole numbers from Nisan, you always end up back at Nisan, -1 day, with usual counting. This causes a problem because most brothers and sisters would agree that the end of the 483 years finishes in Tishri, when Jesus was baptized. The 483 years from Nisan 455 AD would come to the spring of 30 AD and would then be out of synchronization by 6 months with the baptism of Jesus in the autumn. That is why many brethren, including myself, have thought that we should count in lunar years, as then you can finish on Tishri for the baptism of Jesus, and then another 3.5 years later finish in Nisan for the crucifixion. To solve this problem, we need to ask 2 questions. When do sabbatical cycles start? When are years counted from? For this talk, knowing something about the Hebrew calendar and year is very helpful. Look up the biblical calendar, Herb Selinsky, for really good information on this subject. So we have a solar year, any dating system based on the seasonal year of approximately 365.25 days, the time it takes the Earth to revolve once round the Sun. The Gregorian calendar is an example of a solar calendar. The Jewish calendar is lunar solar calendar. So the Jews use it for religious observance. It takes approximately 29.5 days for a complete lunar cycle. Since each lunation is approximately 29.5 days, it is common for the months of a lunar calendar to alternate between 29 and 30. Since the period of 12 such lunations, a lunar year, is 354 days, purely lunar calendars are 11 to 12 days shorter than the solar year. In the biblical calendar, about every 2 to 3 years, an extra month is added to keep the calendar in line with the seasons. The first month, Nisan, begins with the day of the sighting of the new crescent that occurs on the first after the vernal equinox. Counting from the new moon, the Babylonians celebrated every seventh day as a holy day, also called an evil day, meaning unsuitable for prohibited activities. Nisan is the month of beginning, the first month. It's interesting to know that the seventh month, Tishri, is also called the month of beginning, i.e. the start of the second half of the year, Wikipedia. Edwin Thiele shows counting of years takes place in the seventh month. The Babylonians had a second half year. It was not a civil year like the Jews use today. The Babylonian calendar was then used by Israel. So here's the biblical calendar. For the purpose of our study, we only need to consider and know 2 months. The first month, Nisan, and the seventh month, Tishri. There are 12 months in most years, but an extra year is added about every 2 to 3 years due to the shorter lunar year. This is probably the first calendar, with Tishri being the first month. According to Jewish tradition, the earth was created on 1st of Tishri. 1st of Tishri was the first day of the new year. But there comes a change. We read in Exodus 12, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." And then it goes on to talk about the lamb, so we know it's referring to Nisan. So Nisan becomes the first month from Exodus 12, verse 1 and 2. Nisan is in the spring. The Passover is in Nisan. We put it to the reader that the day for proclaiming the year stayed on the 1st of Tishri, as it did in Judah, as Edwin Thiele shows, and is also used today in Israel. This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And the beginning there is Rosh, head, which we looked at last time. Rosh Chodesh, head of months, and Rosh Hashanah, first of Tishri, head of the year. In most calendars, the head of months would coincide with the head of the year, like our January. We can clearly see with the biblical calendar, the head of the year is in the 7th month in the middle of the year. Looking at when Israel entered the land gives us information as to the pattern of biblical cycles and Jubilee cycles. Let's recap. When you come into the land, count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 49 years. Israel came into the land on the 10th of Nisan, 1406 BC, at the start of the Sabbatical cycles and Jubilee cycles. Remember, the Samaritans in their book of Joshua date the first month of the first Sabbatical cycle and of the first Jubilee cycle as beginning with the crossing of the Jordan and the entrance of the Israelites into their possession. When would we have expected Israel to enter the land? If we were to take an educated guess as to what date Israel entered the land, what would it be? Do you think it would be the 23rd of Sivan, the 9th month, or any other random date? Would it not be at exactly the start of a 49-year Jubilee cycle? I'd have thought the 1st of Nisan maybe, at the start of a year and the start of the Jubilee cycles that they were commanded to count. And if sabbatical cycles started on the 1st or 10th of Tishri, we would reasonably expect Israel to enter the land in Tishri. Yet it was the 10th of Nisan that the Jubilee cycles were started. It was the 10th of Tishri that the Jubilee was proclaimed. Notice the pattern here though, 10th of Nisan, 10th of Tishri. Why is counting of the sabbatical cycles and Jubilee cycles 6 months out of synchronization with the start of the Jubilee cycles when they entered the land? We suggest the following. The Jubilee year is proclaimed halfway through the year, and we put it to you that all sabbatical years, all years are counted in the 7th month, halfway through the year starting in Nisan. The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings by Edwin Thiele, the Chronologist, show how he counted from the month Tishri for Judah during the reigns of the kings. He acknowledged that Judah was still using the Nisan calendar as well. We read in Leviticus 25, verse 9, "Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month on the Day of Atonement." It doesn't say the 1st month. The 7th month is in the middle of the year. So we suggest 6 months of the Jubilee year have taken place already. Rodger C. Young, who is a mathematician from Oxford, he tells us this. Counting for Jubilees is on the Day of Atonement on the 10th of Tishri, beginning with the 10th of Tishri, 1407. Notice that counting for years takes place 6 months after entering the land in the middle of the year. Counting of years takes place in the 7th month. The children of Israel came up out of the Jordan on 10th of Nisan, 1406 BC. This is the beginning of years. However, years are not counted at the beginning of the year in Nisan, but are counted in the 7th month, Tishri, in the middle of the year. The first year would be counted on the 1st of Tishri, 1406 BC. That is why the zero for counting begins 1 year before in Tishri, 1407 BC. Therefore, the zero for calculating purposes only for years and Jubilee years starts in Tishri, 1407 BC. The 0 year and the Jubilee year. So I'm trying to say it in different ways. Hopefully one will be a better way of understanding it than another. So on the 10th of Nisan, 1406 BC, the children of Israel entered the promised land. The first year was counted and proclaimed on the 1st of Tishri, 1406 BC, which, as you can see, is halfway through the year, which we're not used to. We count 1 year backwards to find the 0 for counting years. So the 1st of Tishri, 1407 BC, is the date that counting for years should be calculated from. The 0 Jubilee year was on the 10th of Tishri, 1407 BC, 9 days later. So note, years are counted on the 1st of Tishri, Jubilee years are counted on the 10th of Tishri. So 0 Jubilee Tishri, 1407 BC for counting purposes only, because they didn't actually enter the land until 6 months later. The first year would have started on the 10th of Nisan, 1406 BC, the day the children of Israel entered the land. The first year was proclaimed on the 1st of Tishri, 1406 BC, 6 months later in the middle of the year. The first Jubilee year would have started on the 10th of Nisan, 1358 BC. The first Jubilee year was counted and proclaimed on the 10th of Tishri, 1358 BC, 6 months later in the middle of the year. The first Jubilee year would end on the 9th of Nisan, 1357 BC. So you can see from this that the Jubilee year starts 9 days later, counted 9 days later, and finishes 9 days later. So if the Day of Atonement was proclaimed 9 days later than the 49th sabbatical year on the 1st of Tishri, is it not reasonable to suggest that the Jubilee year starts 9 days later than the sabbatical years on 10th of Nisan, the day Israel entered the land and the day the lamb was selected for Passover? And the end of the year is also 9 days later on the 9th of Nisan. So entering the promised land is an enacted parable of entering the kingdom of God. It is totally appropriate and fitting that the start of the 70th Jubilee year will be on the 10th of Nisan, the same day the children of Israel entered the promised land on the 10th of Nisan, and the day the lamb was selected for Passover. The 50th Jubilee year, we suggest, is this: Nisan 10, the start, the middle on Tishri 10, and the end on Nisan 9. Jubilee years are always counted 6 months later at the head of the year on the Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month. Remember, there's 2 heads in the Bible. There's a head of ordinary years and the head of the Jubilee years. and the head is where we count years. And the head of the Jubilee years is counted only on the 49th year of a Jubilee cycle. There are two pieces of prima facie evidence showing that years start in Nisan. Now the Lord spoke to Moses saying, this month, which is Nisan, as we can see reading further when they take the lamb, shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Nisan is in the spring. And the second piece of evidence is Israel entered the land on the 10th of Nisan, 1406 BC, in the spring. If the 1st of Tishri or the 10th of Tishri were the start of the Jubilee year, it would seem reasonable to expect Israel to have entered the land in the month Tishri in the autumn. Of course, there's differences of opinion out there. Many believe that years start in Tishri in the autumn because years are counted in the autumn. Also, they fit in with the agricultural year. Let us test both suggestions against the scriptural record, and we'll find that there can only be one answer we suggest. Do sabbatical cycles start in the spring or autumn? Two views on when the 50th year starts. The Day of Atonement is in the middle of the 50th year, and the year starts in Nisan. Or we believe the 50th year starts on the 10th of Tishri and finishes on the 9th of Tishri. So, in other words, the Day of Atonement is at the start of the Jubilee year. Well, I believe the Day of Atonement is in the middle of the 50th year. If we select the incorrect start date, we will be 6 months out on when Jubilee years start. So this is an important question. Will the 70th Jubilee start on the 10th of Nisan 2024 or the 10th of Tishri 2024, if we accept this date is true? Many say the Day of Atonement is the start of the Jubilee. But we'll look at the evidence now. Here's the biblical calendar. Nisan is in the spring, March, April. This is the time of reaping. Tishri is in the autumn, September, October, the time of sowing. The Jews today have a civil year like our tax year. The 1st of Tishri was the day years were counted in Judah and still are counted today in Israel. So here's the civil calendar starting in Tishri. Tishri is now the first month in the autumn, September, October, the time of sowing. Nisan is now the 7th month in the spring, the time of reaping. So here they are together. The big question is, which calendar do we follow for these 7-year sabbatical cycles and Jubilee cycles? If we follow the wrong calendar, we will be 6 months out on when the years start. The reaping and sowing cycles are also intrinsically linked to the Jubilee cycles. So, do the sabbatical cycles start in the spring or autumn? We suggest the sabbatical cycles start in the spring. The children of Israel entered the land in the spring. So when we look at Leviticus 25, verses 20 to 22, we see that year 8 and 9 can occupy any of the two left-hand columns as a continuation of the Sabbath year in green in the previous column. So let us look at the biblical year starting from Nisan in the spring. Then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. Have you ever wondered why God gives a blessing for 3 years' produce rather than 2, to cover 1 extra year, the Sabbath fallow year? So we can see that you can't sow or reap in the 7th year, the sabbatical year. Sowing is allowed in the 6th year, but it would never be carried out because it could not be reaped in the Sabbath year. The first half of the 8th year would be fallow, as no sowing took place in the sabbatical year. We see that on a year starting in Nisan in the spring, not just 1 year is fallow, but 2 years. This is why God brings forth produce enough for 3 years. Whereas a year starting in Tishri in the autumn is only fallow for 1 year. We can see a possible example of a sabbatical year in Isaiah 37, verse 30, at the time of Hezekiah, as there is no mention of sowing for 2 consecutive years, just like this sabbatical year we can see here. This shall be a sign to you. You shall eat this year such as grows of itself, and the 2nd year what springs from the same. Isaiah 37, verse 30. Some, I suggest, have mistakenly thought it to be a Jubilee year. We will look at this again in study 3 in great detail. The number of years of food needed to keep the Sabbath year for a year beginning in Tishri compared with beginning in Nisan. The sabbatical year beginning in Nisan spring. You can see from the diagram that you would need 3 years of food until reaping can commence again. With a sabbatical year beginning in Tishri autumn, 2 years of food are needed until reaping can commence again. A Nisan spring start to the sabbatical years fits in perfectly with it will produce forth enough for 3 years. If a Tishri autumn start to the sabbatical year was correct, then the scripture would have said, bring forth produce enough for 2 years. How produce is used in a year starting in Nisan. We can see clearly that the land is fallow for 2 years. Leviticus 25 says, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. New produce comes in at the start of the 9th year. Notice the 3 years' food from the 6th year runs out just as the new harvest comes in. How produce is used in a year starting in Tishri. No sowing or reaping in a Sabbath year. And there we see the 3 years. And you shall sow in the 8th year. Yet there is 1 year's worth of crop over from the 6th year, which is out of synchronization with the text. So when does the sabbatical year begin? And you shall sow in the 8th year and eat old produce until the 9th year, until its produce comes in. You shall eat of the old harvest. So here's the 8th year. The Bible says, and you shall sow in the 8th year, and eat old produce until the 9th year. So the year beginning in Nisan is in sequence with the text. Now let's look at a sabbatical year beginning in Tishri, autumn. When it talks about until its produce come in, it's speaking of the 8th year, and the old harvest is year 6. So let's have a look at the 8th year now with a Tishri year. The 8th year, sow, and the 9th year, reap. But as you can see, reaping would take place in the 8th year, out of sequence with the stipulated 9th year. We'll just look at that up in close-up again. Let's go through it again. And you shall sow in the 8th year, and eat old produce until the 9th year, until its produce comes in. The year beginning in Nisan is in sequence with the text. Sowing in the 8th year would mean reaping would take place in the 8th year as well, which is out of sequence with the stipulated 9th year. So conclusion, the criteria in Leviticus is fully met with a sabbatical year or any year that starts on the 1st of Nisan in the spring. The produce is enough for 3 years, and reaping and sowing is in the correct order. The criteria in Leviticus cannot be met for a sabbatical year or any year that starts on the 1st of Tishri in the autumn. The produce for 3 years, when only 2 are needed, and sowing and reaping in the wrong order. As further evidence, let us combine the chronologies in the Bible with history. Edwin R. Thiele, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. This book was a breakthrough in chronology, as many critics said that the years in the Bible across Judah and Israel could not be reconciled. Edwin R. Thiele showed that Judah and Israel used different counting methods and different months to count from. So this is a summary of when years are counted from Edwin R. Thiele. Judah and Israel both start years on the 1st of Nisan in the spring. That's when they begin. Israel year count starts on the 1st of Nisan in the spring. However, Judah's year count starts on the 1st of Tishri in the autumn. That's why we're referring to Judean years rather than just Israel's years, because they had a difference in counting. Yet Judah and Israel both start years on the 1st of Nisan in the spring. We can see that there was some crossover in start dates for Judah and Israel when there was bad kings in Israel, and they mixed with Israel's king, and you can see that they changed the calendar at some times. Which way is the correct way to count years following Judah or Israel? Israel used the Nisan calendar but counted years from Nisan. Judah used the Nisan calendar but counted years from Tishri. There were no good kings of Israel recorded. There were many good kings and prophets of Judah recorded. Can we imagine wayward Israel getting counting of years right when the faithful in Judah misunderstood how to count years using the scriptures? Is inconceivable and not credible. Which way is the correct way to count years? Following Judah or Israel? We should follow Judah. Counting years from the 1st of Tishri, but reckoning of ordinary events and the ecclesiastical year from the 1st of Nisan. Edwin R. Thiele says this, as you can read from Wikipedia, that the ancient kingdom of Judah counted years using the civil year starting in Tishri, while the kingdom of Israel counted years using the ecclesiastical new year starting in Nisan. Tishri is the month used for the counting of the epoch year. The count of the year is incremented on the 1st of Tishri. And he says, perhaps the strongest argument for the use of a Tishri to Tishri regnal year is that the method works. The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, page 53. An example from the Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings shows that Judah kept the ecclesiastical year starting from Nisan, but counted years in the 7th month from Tishri. At the time of Solomon, we read the following from his book, page 52. 7 years for building of the temple can be secured only when regnal years are computed from Tishri to Tishri, but with a Nisan to Nisan year used for the reckoning of ordinary events and the ecclesiastical year. Josephus says the same here. Moses appointed Nisan as the 1st month for the festivals, the commencement of the year, for everything relating to divine worship. But for selling and buying and other ordinary affairs, he preserved the ancient order, i.e. the year beginning with Tishri. So we can see clearly that 2 counting methods were used by Israel and Judah. So you start the month, the beginning of the month is Nisan, but you count in Tishri. The practice of Judah is continued in modern Judaism. It's interesting to note the smallest unit of time in the 70-week prophecy is 7 years. And Messiah was cut off in the middle of the week. We've been counting in the middle of the years, haven't we? Isn't that interesting? The Messiah cut off in the middle of the week. So conclusion, the sabbatical cycles start in the spring. Months start on the 1st of Nisan. Years are counted on the 1st of Tishri. The children of Israel entered the land in the spring. They reaped and sowed. If, of course, we are correct in our interpretation, then the start of the 70th Jubilee Cycle will be in the spring on the 10th of Nisan, 2024. The 70th Jubilee Cycle will be counted and proclaimed in the autumn on the 10th of Tishri, 2024. The 70th Jubilee Cycle will end in the spring on the 9th of Nisan 2025. So we looked at this decree concerning the first coming of Christ. And if we counted as we normally can, 69 weeks would come to spring again, not Tishri when Jesus was baptized. A further 3.5 years ministry of Jesus would come to autumn, yet Jesus was crucified in the spring. So let us now revisit counting these periods following Daniel 9 and with the information put forward in this presentation. This is a suggestion only. There shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, starting from the 1st of Nisan, BC 455. So the Feast of Trumpets, the 1st of Tishri, is when we count years. The count of the 483 years would start on Nisan 1 and finish on Tishri 1 AD 29. the 483 years being proclaimed in the middle of the year and counted. The baptism of Jesus, there shall be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Jesus was baptized around Tishri time, most probably the 1st of Tishri. And then we read in Daniel 9, verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Notice how this verse is distinct from the other 69 weeks, which are mentioned together. So we're going to resume our count from the 1st of Tishri, AD 29, in the autumn. And we're going to count our 7 years, and we read 3.5 years later would bring us to Nisan AD 33, the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus in the spring. So he is crucified in the middle of the 7-year period, 3.5 years later. So Jubilee years are always counted and proclaimed 6 months later in the middle of the year on the Day of Atonement. So we suggest the following. On the 10th of Nisan, Israel entered the Promised Land, and on the 10th of Nisan, the Lamb was chosen. On the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb. All the offerings, the spring feasts, the Passover, and all the fall feasts up to the Day of Atonement, 6 months later, all pointed to the one sacrifice of Christ. The Jubilee year would have to continue for 6 months until all the offerings and feasts had been completed. All symbols pointing to the one offering of Christ. Then and only then could the Jubilee be proclaimed on the Day of Atonement in the middle of the Jubilee year. So on presentation 3, we hope to look at, is the Jubilee cycle 49 or 50 years? When does the 50th year start in relation to the 49 years and its position in the Jubilee cycle? We will look at the possibility of Hezekiah's Jubilee. We will look at the verse, no one knows the day or hour, in context, and just put forward a suggestion of a different interpretation. And then we'll have a final exhortation.